The gentle hum of gospel music filled Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins' old Toyota Camry as she drove home from choir practice. The sunset painted the Georgia sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple, and her heart felt light after spending the evening doing what she loved most, leading her church choir. At 68, she'd been directing the choir for over 30 years, and those Tuesday evening practices were the highlight of her week. She hummed along to Amazing Grace, playing softly on her car radio, her fingers tapping gently on the steering wheel. The familiar streets of her hometown rolled by. The same corner store where she bought penny candy as a child, the park where she'd taught both her children to ride their bikes, and the school where she'd shaped young minds for 4 decades before retiring. The dashboard clock showed 7:45 p.m. She smiled, thinking about the hot cup of chamomile tea and her favorite evening game show waiting for her at home. Her grandson had recently taught her how to record TV shows, and she'd been practicing this new skill religiously. The peaceful moment shattered as blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Mrs. Jenkins' heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. In all her years of driving, she'd only been pulled over once, for a broken taillight back in '92. She carefully checked her mirrors and put on her turn signal, pulling over to the right side of the empty street, just like her late husband had taught her. She could see the police cruiser in her mirror, its bright lights making it hard to see the officer inside. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she reached for her purse on the passenger seat, where she always kept her license and registration neatly tucked in a separate envelope. The church choir director lanyard around her neck swayed as she moved, its familiar weight somewhat comforting. Through her side mirror, Mrs. Jenkins watched as the officer stepped out of his vehicle. Something about his aggressive stance made her stomach tighten. Officer James Barrett's heavy boots crunched on the gravel, each step echoing in the quiet evening air. His hand wasn't just resting on his holster, his fingers were wrapped around it, despite her "Blessed are the peacemakers" and church choir director bumper stickers clearly visible on her well-maintained car. The street had grown eerily quiet. The only sounds were the idling of both engines and the distant barking of someone's dog. A young couple walking their dog on the sidewalk slowed their pace, their casual evening stroll interrupted by the scene unfolding before them. Mrs. Jenkins noticed them in her mirror, saw their concerned expressions as they pulled out their phones. Her own phone sat in its holder on the dashboard, displaying a text from her son that had arrived just minutes before. "Hope choir practice went well, Mama. Don't forget to take your evening medicine." The sight of it gave her strength, reminding her that she wasn't alone, even in this moment. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, saying a quick prayer under her breath, something she'd done countless times while facing life's challenges. She rolled down her window, letting in the warm evening air. The crickets had started their nightly chorus, a sound that usually brought her peace. But tonight, as Officer Barrett's shadow fell across her car door, that familiar sound felt ominous. She couldn't see his face clearly in the growing darkness, but his body language spoke volumes. His flashlight beam hit her eyes with unnecessary brightness, making her squint. "License and registration," he barked, without introducing himself or explaining why he pulled her over. The respect and courtesy she'd earned over decades of community service meant nothing in this moment. Mrs. Jenkins had lived through the civil rights era. She'd seen both progress and setbacks in her lifetime. As she reached for her documents with trembling fingers, she silently prayed that this would be nothing more than an unpleasant interruption to her otherwise peaceful evening. But something in Officer Barrett's rigid stance and cold tone told her this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. Mrs. Jenkins held her license and registration with steady hands, despite her growing unease. The evening air had turned cooler and goosebumps rose on her arms, though not from the temperature. Officer Barrett's flashlight beam darted around her car's interior, the harsh light lingering on her choir books in the back seat and the small cross hanging from her rearview mirror. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" His tone carried an edge that made her heart beat faster. Through the years of teaching middle school, Mrs. Jenkins had learned to read people well. Something wasn't right about this situation, not right at all. "No, sir, I don't," she replied politely, a soft voice carrying the gentle lilt of her southern upbringing. "I was being careful with my speed and signaling all my turns." She noticed his nameplate catching the light from a nearby street lamp. His badge number was partially obscured by the way he stood. Officer Barrett's response came quick and sharp. "I saw you swerving." The accusation hung in the air, as false as could be. Mrs. Jenkins had driven this route every Tuesday for longer than this officer had probably been alive. Her Toyota might be 10 years old, but she maintained it meticulously, and her driving was always careful. "Sir, I respect your work, but I wasn't swerving." She kept her voice calm and steady, just as she used to when addressing troubled students. "I've been driving home from choir practice, taking the same route I always do." The officer's hand tightened on his flashlight. "Step out of the vehicle." It wasn't a request, it was a command that sent chills down her spine. "May I ask why?" Mrs. Jenkins' question was reasonable, her tone respectful. But Officer Barrett's reaction was immediate and aggressive. He grabbed the door handle, yanking it open with unnecessary force. "I said, step out of the vehicle. I can smell alcohol." The accusation was so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't so frightening. Mrs. Jenkins hadn't touched a drop of alcohol in her entire life, not even communion wine, as her church used grape juice. More cars were slowing down now. The young couple from earlier had stopped completely, their phones raised. Other neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Jenkins could see Mrs. Thompson from the corner house, standing on her porch, phone pressed to her ear. The cool metal of her emergency alert pendant pressed against her chest under her blouse, a gift from her son after her hip surgery last year. One press would send in her location, but reaching for it now might escalate things further. "Officer, I'm a retired school teacher and church choir director. I've never had a drink in my life." Her voice remained steady, though her heart raced. "My doctor's note about my recent hip surgery is in my glove compartment. I need to move carefully." But Officer Barrett wasn't listening. His face had taken on a reddish hue visible even in the dim evening light. "Your kind always has an excuse," he muttered, words that shouldn't have been said, revealing prejudices that shouldn't exist. The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones out now, recording everything. Mrs. Jenkins could hear whispered conversations, could feel the tension building in the air. She thought of all her years teaching children about respect, about judging people by their character rather than their appearance. How many of those lessons had reached the homes of officers like Barrett? Her hand trembled as she reached for her seatbelt buckle. The click seemed unusually loud in the tense atmosphere. Her hip was already aching. The evening chill always made it worse. But it wasn't just physical pain she worried about now. Time seemed to slow down as she carefully began to turn in her seat. Her choir books slid slightly on the back seat, the sound drawing another harsh sweep of the flashlight beam. Through her open window, she could smell someone's dinner cooking, pot roast maybe, such a normal, peaceful evening smell in such an increasingly dangerous moment. Her emergency alert pendant felt heavier with each passing second. Her son's text message still glowed on her phone screen. "Don't forget to take your evening medicine." How quickly this routine drive home had turned into something that would need more than medicine to fix. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as Officer Barrett's patience visibly thinned. Mrs. Jenkins said another silent prayer, knowing the next few moments would change everything. She just didn't know yet if that change would bring justice or tragedy. The evening air grew heavier with tension as Mrs. Jenkins carefully shifted her weight to step out of her car. Her hip protested with each movement, a reminder of her surgery just 4 months ago. The doctor had warned her about sudden movements, but Officer Barrett wasn't showing any patience for her careful pace. "I said get out, now." His voice carried down the street, causing more porch lights to flick on. The neighborhood was waking up to this unfolding scene, and more witnesses appeared with each passing minute. The young mother from 3 houses down stood in her driveway, phone raised high, her toddler watching wide-eyed from behind her legs. Mrs. Jenkins gripped her steering wheel for support as she slowly stood. Her choir books tumbled from her lap, spreading across the pavement like scattered doves. The sight of her precious music books lying in the street brought tears to her eyes. Some of those books had been with her for 30 years, their margins filled with notes from countless services. "Please, officer, let me gather my books." Her voice remained dignified despite her growing fear. But Officer Barrett wasn't interested in her books or her dignity. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the car with unnecessary force. Her hip screamed in protest, and she couldn't hold back a cry of pain. "Stop resisting!" Barrett shouted, though Mrs. Jenkins hadn't shown any resistance beyond her slow, careful movements. The crowd, growing on the sidewalk, stood restlessly. Someone called out, "She's not resisting. Leave her alone." Another voice joined in, "That's Mrs. Jenkins. She taught my kids." The screen of her phone lit up inside the car. Another text from her son, but she couldn't reach it now. Her emergency alert pendant swung beneath her blouse as Officer Barrett forced her away from her vehicle. The metal was warm against her skin, reminding her that help was just one press away. "Officer, please," Mrs. Jenkins tried again, her voice steady despite her situation. "My doctor's note is right there in the glove compartment. I had hip surgery recently." She gestured toward the car, but this only seemed to agitate Barrett further. "Stop moving your hands," he barked, though she'd done nothing threatening. His grip tightened on her arm, surely leaving bruises that would later tell their own story. The beam of his flashlight swung wildly, catching the faces in the crowd, reflecting off dozens of phone screens recording every moment. One of her choir books lay open near her feet, its pages ruffling in the evening breeze. It was her favorite hymnal, the one she'd used to teach generations of children about harmony and hope. Now its pages were bent against the rough pavement, much like her dignity was being bent by this officer's actions. Mrs. Thompson's voice carried from her porch, clear and angry as she spoke into her phone. "Yes, I need to report an officer. He's manhandling Mrs. Jenkins. Yes, the choir director. Send someone now." Other voices joined in, a chorus of concern and outrage growing louder with each passing moment. The street had transformed from a quiet residential road into an arena of injustice. Car headlights illuminated the scene from both directions as traffic slowed to witness what was happening. The flash of cell phone cameras created a strobe-like effect, recording every second of this abuse of power. Mrs. Jenkins felt her legs weakening. Standing this long was difficult since her surgery. But Officer Barrett showed no sign of letting her sit down or rest. His face had grown redder, his actions more aggressive as he realized how many people were watching, how many cameras were recording. "I smell alcohol coming from the vehicle," he announced loudly, clearly trying to justify his actions to the gathering crowd. But his words were met with scoffs and angry mutters. Everyone knew Mrs. Jenkins, knew her character, her dedication to her church, her lifetime of service to the community. A gust of wind scattered more pages from her hymnals across the pavement. Each sheet contained songs of praise, of justice, of hope, songs she'd taught countless children over the years. Now those same pages swirled around her feet as she stood, trembling but unbowed, in the grip of an officer who seemed determined to strip away her dignity. But dignity, Mrs. Jenkins knew, came from within. Even as her hip ached and fear coursed through her veins, she held on to her composure. Her mama had taught her long ago that there would be moments like this. Moments when all you could do was stand tall and let your truth shine through. The emergency alert pendant pressed against her chest with each ragged breath. Her son's words echoed in her mind. "One press, Mama, that's all it takes." As Officer Barrett's grip tightened again, as her legs threatened to give way, as the crowd's angry murmurs grew louder, she knew it was time. With trembling fingers, she reached for the pendant, praying her son would arrive before things got worse. The small red button on Mrs. Jenkins' emergency pendant felt like hope beneath her trembling fingers. As she pressed it, a tiny light blinked twice, confirmation that her signal for help had gone through. Her son's law office was just 2 blocks away, and she knew he always worked late on Tuesday nights, reviewing cases after the office quieted down. Officer Barrett was too focused on controlling the situation to notice her subtle movement. The crowd had grown larger, their collective voice rising with concern and anger. Mrs. Jenkins recognized faces she'd taught years ago, parents of children who'd sung in her choir, neighbors who'd shared countless Sunday dinners with her family. "She can barely stand," someone shouted from the gathering crowd. It was true. Her hip was screaming in protest now, the pain shooting down her leg like lightning. The doctor had warned her about standing too long, about sudden movements. But Officer Barrett's grip on her arm left no room for medical concerns. Through the haze of discomfort and fear, Mrs. Jenkins heard the distinctive sound of quick footsteps approaching. The crowd parted like a curtain, and there stood her son, briefcase still in hand, tie slightly askew from his rush to reach her. His face showed concern, but his eyes held the steady determination she'd seen in him since he was a boy standing up to playground bullies. "Mama." His voice carried the weight of both worry and authority. He set his briefcase down carefully, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Officer, I'm Mrs. Jenkins' son, and I'm also an attorney. I'm going to approach slowly." Officer Barrett's stance shifted, his grip on Mrs. Jenkins' arm tightening slightly. "Stay back. This is a police matter." But there was a new note in his voice, uncertainty creeping in around the edges of his authority. "I can see that, sir," Osam replied, his voice steady and professional. "I can also see that you're handling my elderly mother, who had hip surgery 4 months ago. Let's talk about this calmly." He took another careful step forward, hands visible at his sides. Mrs. Jenkins felt tears of relief threatening to fall, but she held them back. Her son had inherited his father's height and his mother's quiet strength. Even in this tense moment, his tie was perfectly knotted. She'd taught him how to tie it properly when he was just 12 years old, practicing for his first school debate. The cell phones recording the scene captured every word as her son continued, "Officer, I notice your body camera appears to be off. Department policy requires it to be activated during all civilian interactions. Could you please explain why it isn't recording this encounter?" The question hung in the air like summer lightning. Officer Barrett's grip loosened slightly as he glanced down at his chest, where his dark body camera sat silent and unblinking. More people had gathered now, their phones creating a digital record that would soon spread across the city. "Also," her son continued, pulling out his own phone, "I'm on the line with Lieutenant Richardson from Internal Affairs. He's very interested in this situation. This wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm precision he used in courtrooms." Mrs. Jenkins watched her boy, now a respected attorney, handle the situation with the grace and dignity she'd always tried to instill in him. Even as her hip throbbed and her arm ached where Barrett held it, pride swelled in her chest. This was the same child who'd sat at her kitchen table studying law books until midnight, who'd promised his late father he'd always protect his mama. The neighbors pressed closer, their phones recording every moment. Mrs. Thompson had brought out a folding chair, trying to push it closer for Mrs. Jenkins to sit. The young couple who'd first witnessed the stop were still there, their dogs sitting quietly at their feet, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. "Officer Barrett," her son spoke again, having noted the name tag in the street light, "I'm going to reach for my business card. Then we're going to discuss how to resolve this situation properly." His hand moved slowly toward his pocket, each movement measured and calm. Mrs. Jenkins felt the tension in Officer Barrett's grip wavering. Her son's presence had changed the dynamics completely, not through threats or aggression, but through the calm assertion of rights and knowledge of the law. This was what she'd always taught her students, that education and dignity were the most powerful weapons against injustice. The night air had grown cooler, and her choir books still lay scattered on the ground, their pages fluttering in the breeze. But now, with her son standing there, the fear that had gripped her heart began to loosen its hold. The same boy who'd once asked her to explain why some people hated others without reason was now a man standing firm against that very hatred. The business card in her son's hand caught the streetlight as he held it out, his Harvard Law credentials gleaming in gold lettering. Officer Barrett's eyes flickered between the card, and the growing number of phone cameras pointed his way. The night had grown still, except for the quiet murmur of concerned neighbors and the distant sound of approaching sirens. "My mother's medical records are in her glove compartment," her son continued, his voice carrying the same gentle strength she'd heard in church when he gave guest sermons. "I'd like to retrieve them, with your permission, Officer Barrett." He emphasized the name, making it clear that everything happening now would be remembered, documented, and addressed. Mrs. Jenkins felt the officer's grip finally loosen on her arm. Her son gestured to Mrs. Thompson, who quickly brought forward the folding chair. "Mama, please sit down before your hip gives out," he said, his professional tone softening with concern for his mother. As Mrs. Jenkins carefully lowered herself into the chair, her son pulled out his phone again, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "I'm noting the time is 8:17 p.m. Officer Barrett, I've already documented the following violations of department policy: failure to activate body camera, excessive force against an elderly civilian, and failure to state the reason for the traffic stop. The small crowd had grown larger, with people spreading out along the sidewalk. Some held their phones high, others stood with arms crossed, watching justice unfold in real time. A young boy, no more than 12, whispered loudly to his mother, "That's my English teacher from last year." The simple statement seemed to make Officer Barrett shrink slightly, as if suddenly realizing who he'd been manhandling. Her son continued his methodical documentation, speaking clearly for the benefit of all the recording devices. "I observed bruising beginning to form on my mother's right arm. The dash camera appears to be functional, though oddly, it seems to be the only recording device active on your vehicle, officer." He paused, letting the implication sink in. 2 more police cars pulled up, their lights casting blue and red shadows across the scene. Mrs. Jenkins recognized one of the officers stepping out, Officer Washington, whose daughter had sung in her choir just last Sunday. The look of shock on his face when he realized who was sitting in the folding chair spoke volumes. "Mrs. Jenkins." Officer Washington's voice carried his disbelief. "What's going on here?" He looked between her son, and Officer Barrett, whose face had begun to show beads of sweat despite the cool evening air. Her son stepped forward, still maintaining his professional demeanor. "Officer Washington, good evening. I've already contacted Internal Affairs about this situation. Would you mind calling Lieutenant Richardson? He's expecting an update." The mention of the Internal Affairs lieutenant made Officer Barrett's posture stiffen. Mrs. Jenkins watched as her scattered choir books were carefully collected by neighbors, their pages smoothed with gentle hands. Someone had picked up her favorite hymnal, the one with her late husband's notes in the margins, and was trying to dry its pages with a tissue. "My client, who is also my mother, was pulled over without cause," her son continued, his legal training evident in every word. She was then forcibly removed from her vehicle despite informing Officer Barrett of her recent hip surgery. "I've documented at least 7 policy violations so far, and I'm particularly concerned about the disabled body camera." Officer Washington was already on his radio, his voice low but urgent. The crowd had grown quieter, sensing the shift in power. Even the crickets seemed to have paused that evening psalm to witness justice taking shape. Mrs. Jenkins rubbed her sore arm gently, thinking about the Sunday school lesson she was preparing for the weekend, about David standing up to Goliath, about courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Her son had learned those lessons well, she thought proudly. "Officer Barrett," her son's voice cut through the night air again, "I suggest you step aside and let Officer Washington handle this situation from here. We'll be filing a formal complaint first thing in the morning, but right now, my mother needs medical attention for her arm and hip." The emergency response team had arrived, their ambulance parking quietly at the corner. Mrs. Jenkins could see her neighbors continuing to record everything, their phones tracking every movement as Officer Barrett finally stepped back, his authority deflating like a punctured balloon. Her son knelt beside her chair, his voice softening as he spoke just to her. "Are you okay, Mama? The paramedics are here to check you out." His hand found hers, strong and steady, just like his father's had been. In that moment, she saw not just the accomplished attorney, but also the little boy who'd always promised to protect her. The night air carried the scent of jasmine from Mrs. Thompson's garden, a sweet contrast to the tension that still lingered. But now, surrounded by neighbors, supported by her son, and watched over by Officer Washington, Mrs. Jenkins felt the first real sense of safety since those police lights had first flashed in her rearview mirror. The morning after the incident, Mrs. Jenkins' story spread through the town like wildfire. By sunrise, video clips from multiple angles had made their way across social media. The local news van parked outside her son's law office, where reporters gathered hoping to catch a statement about what had happened to their beloved choir director. Inside the office, Mrs. Jenkins sat in a comfortable leather chair, her arms showing dark bruises that stood out starkly against her skin. Her son worked methodically at his desk, his telephone constantly buzzing with messages of support and offers to testify about Officer Barrett's past behavior. "Look at this, Mama," he said, turning his computer screen to show her the flood of emails. "Your former students are coming forward. There's a pattern here." His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as he documented each new piece of evidence. The wall behind him displayed his law degrees and community service awards, achievements that had prepared him for this very moment. The police chief called personally, his voice heavy with concern over the speakerphone. "Mrs. Jenkins, I want to express my deepest apologies. Officer Barrett has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." The chief had known her for years. She'd taught his children, watched them grow up singing in her choir. Local news coverage played on the small TV in the corner of the office. The morning anchor's voice was filled with barely contained anger as she reported, "Beloved retired teacher and choir director assaulted during routine traffic stop." The footage from the previous night played again and again, dozens of angles showing the truth that couldn't be denied. Mrs. Jenkins watched as her son prepared the official complaint, his legal training transforming her traumatic experience into powerful testimony. "Each violation will be addressed," he assured her, reviewing the documents. The disabled body camera, the excessive force, the racial profiling, everything. Throughout the day, more stories emerged. A young woman came forward, sharing how Officer Barrett had harassed her grandmother months earlier. A college student revealed footage from his own encounter. Each new testimony added weight to Mrs. Jenkins' case, building a mountain of evidence that could no longer be ignored. The bruises on her arm ached as she reached for her cup of tea, but her spirit remained unbroken. Her phone kept lighting up with messages from her choir members, each one offering support and prayers. The youth choir had even recorded a video of themselves singing her favorite hymn, sending it with the message, "We love you, Mrs. Jenkins. Stay strong." By afternoon, the police department issued a formal statement announcing a comprehensive review of all complaints against Officer Barrett. Internal affairs investigators arrived at her son's office, their faces grim as they reviewed the evidence. Lieutenant Richardson, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, sat with Mrs. Jenkins for hours, recording her statement with meticulous care. "Your courage in coming forward will help others," Lieutenant Richardson said softly after stopping the recorder. "We've needed something like this to push for real change." She shared a knowing look with Mrs. Jenkins, two women who understood the weight of this moment. The local church community rallied around their choir director. Reverend Powell organized a prayer vigil, but it quickly transformed into something larger, a peaceful gathering calling for police accountability. Hundreds gathered in the church parking lot, holding candles and singing the very hymns Mrs. Jenkins had taught them over the years. As evening approached, her son reviewed the final draft of the civil rights lawsuit. The documents detailed not just her experience, but the pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Each page represented hope for change, a chance to protect others from similar treatment. "The settlement isn't the goal," her son explained to the gathering of supporters in his office. "We're pushing for policy changes, mandatory bias training, and a civilian oversight committee." His voice carried the same determination she'd heard in his father's voice years ago, fighting for integration in their town schools. Mrs. Jenkins sat quietly, watching her son work. The bruises would fade, but the impact of this case would ripple through their community for years to come. Her students had always asked why she taught them both music and civil rights history during choir practice. Now they understood. Both were about harmony, about voices rising together for something greater than themselves. The sun was setting when Officer Washington stopped by the office, off-duty and in plain clothes. He carried her recovered choir books, carefully dried and restored by his wife. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I promise you, things are going to change. Your case has opened a lot of eyes." As she held her beloved hymnals, Mrs. Jenkins thought about all the songs of justice and hope she'd taught over the years. Sometimes, she realized, living those songs was as important as singing them. Her pain and fear from the previous night were transforming into something powerful, a catalyst for the change their community had long needed. 6 months after that fateful Tuesday night, Mrs. Jenkins stood at her choir podium, watching as her church filled with an unusual mix of people. Police officers in uniform sat beside community members, their badges catching the light from stained glass windows. This wasn't a regular service. It was the first graduation ceremony for the police department's new community relations program. The changes had come steadily after her case made headlines. Officer Barrett's termination was just the beginning. The investigation had uncovered dozens of similar complaints that had been buried over the years. But more importantly, it had sparked a conversation that couldn't be silenced. Her son had been clever with the settlement money. Instead of keeping it, they established a legal aid fund for victims of racial profiling, Mama's Harmony Fund. They called it, a name that made her tear up every time she heard it. Already, the fund had helped 3 families get proper legal representation. Mrs. Jenkins called a young officer after the ceremony. "Your story changed everything for us." He was fresh from the academy, part of the first class to go through the new mandatory bias training. They show us the videos from that night during training. It helps us understand the impact we can have, good or bad. The Civilian Oversight Committee met monthly now in the church basement after her choir practice. Mrs. Jenkins often heard their discussions as she packed up her music sheets, community members and police officers actually talking to each other, working through problems together. It wasn't always harmonious, but like she always told her choir, harmony takes practice. Her hip had healed well, though cold weather still made it ache. The bruises on her arm had faded, but the story they told had left permanent marks on the community's conscience. Young officers now trained differently, learned differently, and most importantly, acted differently during traffic stops. The changes spread beyond their town. Other police departments started requesting copies of their new training programs. Mrs. Jenkins found herself invited to speak at police academies, sharing her story not with anger, but with hope for change. Her son often accompanied her, turning her experience into teachable moments about law, justice, and human dignity. "Remember," she would tell the cadets, "behind every traffic stop is a human being with a story." She'd watch their faces as she described that night, not just the fear and pain, but the community's response, the power of people coming together for change. Her choir had grown too. Police officers' children now sang alongside the kids she'd taught for years. During practices, she'd hear them talking, sharing stories, breaking down barriers that had stood for generations. Music had always been her tool for teaching harmony, and now it was helping heal the community. The youth group she led had taken on a new project, inspired by her experience. They called it Know Your Rights, Know Your Music, workshops that combined civil rights education with gospel singing. It was exactly the kind of thing that would have made her late husband smile. One evening, as she sat reviewing sheet music for the next Sunday service, Officer Washington's daughter brought her a drawing. It showed Mrs. Jenkins at her choir podium, but instead of just choir members, the picture showed police officers and community members singing together. "This is what harmony looks like," the girl had written at the bottom. The local police academy added a new requirement. Every cadet had to attend at least one community event before graduation. Many chose to come to her choir practices. "We learn more about community relations in your choir room than we do in some of our classes," one cadet told her. Music has a way of making people listen to each other. Her son had moved his law office to a bigger building, but he kept a photo on his desk from that night, not of the confrontation, but of the aftermath. It showed Mrs. Jenkins surrounded by neighbors, her choir books being carefully gathered up. "That's what community looks like," he'd tell his clients. People standing together, picking up the pieces, making things right. The emergency alert pendant still hung around her neck, though she hadn't needed to use it again. Now it served as a reminder of both vulnerability and strength, of fear and courage, of how quickly things can change and how long change can take to happen. Late one Tuesday evening, almost exactly a year after the incident, Mrs. Jenkins sat at her piano at home. Her fingers found the keys of an old civil rights song, one her mother had taught her. As she played, she thought about all the changes: the new police chief's open-door policy, the monthly community dialogues, the legal aid fund helping families seek justice. The bruises had faded, but something stronger had grown in their place, a community transformed by truth, united by music, and committed to change. Her choir books sat neatly on the piano, their pages no longer bearing the marks of that night. Like the community itself, they had been carefully mended, made stronger at the broken places. Mrs. Jenkins smiled as she played the final notes. Tomorrow would bring another choir practice, another chance to teach harmony, both in music and in life. And in the pews, as always, there would be new faces learning to sing along with familiar ones, their voices rising together in hope for a better tomorrow.